Alright, so in this video we are looking at international competitiveness targeting this key knowledge area, and what you'll find is that there are 5 different factors that will affect Australia's international competitiveness. So we've talked about competitiveness in general throughout this year a lot, and there are typically 3 ways that businesses can gain an advantage. The first one is that they can always compete with price, but they can also compete with quality and also with their management. And so by management, I mean that there may be certain countries that have greater levels of technology, which allows them to go through their supply chain faster or in a more efficient way. And that ultimately allows them to produce greater quantities, which allows them to gain an edge over their competitors. And so if you look back at this key knowledge point and you read through the different factors, starting with productivity, production costs, natural resources, exchange rates, and relative rates of inflation, what you find is that all 5 of these primarily relate to the first advantage here, which is related to price. So, the definition of international competitiveness is a country's ability to compete in global markets for goods and services. And so we are able to achieve improved international competitiveness if we are able to lower our costs of production, meaning that final prices are going also to be lowered, which makes it more attractive for foreign purchasers. So now we're going to look at each individual factor in the study design one by one, keeping this key question in mind. How will this factor improve international competition? And so the first factor we're looking at is productivity. And remember that productivity relates to our efficiency with our resources. Thinking about how much output are we able to create given our level of inputs. And so if we are improving our productivity, what that allows us to do is create greater quantities of exports. And if you think about the economies of scale, where the average cost of production per unit is going to decrease as we scale up our production levels, this means that our real unit costs of production is going to decrease as well, allowing businesses to drop their final prices, which then allows us to gain a competitive edge. And so we review the overall impact due to a lower price. What we'd likely see is that more foreigners are going to be purchasing Australian goods and services, and that will also have a long-term effect of us receiving greater revenues, which is passed on to employees, which then allows them to have a greater income, which improves their material living standards as well. Looking at factor number 2, production costs, a reminder that there are 2 big branches of costs. You have fixed costs that businesses incur regardless of production levels. So you're thinking about monthly rental costs, perhaps monthly internet bills or monthly phone bills. And you also have variable costs, which will fluctuate depending on how much you're producing. So if you're producing a small quantity in a given period, then you'd expect costs to be lowered. Maybe material costs or wage costs would be falling. However, in another period where there's high quantities required to be produced, those same costs are likely to be also higher. And so the major costs of production that we think about is labor costs, capital costs, and raw material costs. And similar to productivity, if we're able to reduce our production costs, it means we're able to lower our final prices, which means that our export prices are more attractive. There's also downward pressure on cost inflation, because if businesses are able to produce in a less expensive way, this means that they're also allowed to either sustain their final prices or even drop them. And a combination of these effects means that there's overall an increasing demand for labor and production. And so you can link this to the goal of full employment and also economic growth as well. And clearly the link with a downward pressure on cost inflation is also going to help sustain a lower level of inflation if that's Australia's goal. However, if Australia's goal is to improve inflation, then through the greater incomes that laborers will start earning, they will have more spending power, and as more money flows through the business sector, prices will be pushed up, therefore achieving a higher level of inflation. Factor number 3 is the availability of natural resources, a fairly simple one, but if you think about it, if a country is able to source all of their natural resources domestically, this avoids the businesses having to go through importing costs, travel times, setup costs, and all the other costs associated with importing. And so once again, this is going to help reduce costs of production. Now, it is important to consider a country's resource endowments, meaning how much resources do they actually have? Because if there's a low supply of natural resources and the costs associated with extracting those natural resources is much larger than the benefits that you would receive, then it may not be worth it to go through with that expedition, and you may prefer to simply import those same resources from other countries as well. And given the context of Australia being a relatively young country, our availability of natural resources is very, very high, meaning that we have an exporting advantage against our other foreign competitors. So the fourth factor is exchange rates. And remember that exchange rates will ultimately influence the relative price of the good or service that we are either purchasing or selling. It's important to remember that the exchange rate does not necessarily change the final price of the item. However, it changes the amount that a foreigner may need to convert into the appropriate currency, which is then going to change their relative costs. And so the general rule is that if the Australian dollar is appreciating, it makes our exports relatively more expensive, because what that means is that foreigner is required to exchange more of their own currency to obtain the same amount of Australian dollars to make that purchase. And the opposite is true if the Australian dollar has depreciated, where that same person will require less. And the final factor is inflation, and it is directly linked to the final prices of goods and services. And so it should be fairly obvious that if the domestic prices are relatively lower than our international trading partners, then this is going to attract greater volumes of export sales. And once again, you can think about how an increase in the volumes of export sales is going to influence economic growth through higher levels of production, and the goal of full employment through the increased demand for labor to facilitate the increase in production levels. So let's summarize this video. Hopefully you should be aware that the common theme with international competitiveness is that it, one way or another, will influence our exporting sector the most. And given Australia's context of us being a highly exporting nation, international competitiveness is a fairly important factor for us. And so if we're able to achieve improvements, it means the export sector is more profitable, we're able to achieve more sustained rates of inflation, and we can also experience a higher demand for labor due to the higher level of production that were required due to the exporting sector flourishing. And so through improved competitiveness, domestic businesses are also able to receive benefits through cheaper domestic products. Perhaps those same products that we export is also sold domestically, thinking about wine, thinking about wheat, thinking about beef. And so there are also indirect domestic benefits associated with international competitiveness. And if there's more income circulating in the economy, it also means that businesses receive more expenditures from the household sector. And this is also going to improve living standards through higher levels of profitability. And so that concludes this video. Hopefully a relatively easier dot point to understand, and you can see how those factors will influence international competitiveness.